So meal timing, what is it? How do we do it? And how does it pertain to getting more muscle and losing more fat? So meal timing is basically just going to be where we have each of our macronutrients throughout the day, or what kind of meals are we eating at what times, especially sort of around that training window. So the main things that we're going to be timing is our macronutrients. So we have protein, carbs, fats. Protein being probably the most important. The way you can think about protein is it is the building block of muscle. So at any point in time, if we need to repair our muscle, we need to have protein present. You can think of it as the bricks of a house. If we're building a house, the protein's the bricks, the carb's going to be the workers. No matter how many workers you have chilling there, they're not going to build any kind of house unless they have bricks to put up. So we need protein always to be present if we want to retain or if we want to gain muscle. We need to have it present from the food that we eat, or it's going to pull it from where we already have it. The only way we already have it is other muscle, so it will use more dormant muscles to create the more active muscles that have been broken down. I want to have access all the time of the day, so it needs to be evenly spread. Now carbs, as we said, those are the workers, but if we do have too much protein, protein can actually convert into carbohydrates through gluconeogenesis and provide help that way and help put itself up. Ideally, you want to have carbs because usually they're going to be more tasty and they're going to be cheaper, easier to eat, and faster to access straight away for our body. So what are carbs? They're energy. And when do we need them? Any process that requires energy, so our entire bodily processes. But as it pertains to gaining muscle and losing fat, we need it around our training. And or any cardio, if we're sort of trying to lean into the gaining muscle, we might need some around cardio. We might not necessarily want to be doing high intensity cardio fasted or without the presence of carbohydrates, as that might lean us into burning more muscle tissue. Low intensity will be fine, but the main one will be our training window. Now fats, what do? Their main purpose is going to be hormone creation. Brain is made up of mostly fat. Important health markers come from having a lot of good fats. So health and hormones is going to be the main purpose. And when do we want to have them? Around the timing of fats, the main thing that they do is they slow digestion of our other macronutrients. So any time that we want to have our food be slowed down, such as at night, when we're not going to get any more food, that is when we would ideally have our fats. Or maybe if you are a person that rips through your carbs, you have a really high metabolism, prior to training, you might want to throw some fats in there to help extend that out and give you a more of a drip feed of the carbohydrates while you're training. So starting with protein, what do we want to do with our timing? Obviously depends how many meals we're having, but the ideal would be somewhere at least 4 meals and somewhere up to 6 is where it's going to be most effective. So we'll say 5, somewhere in the middle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if we are a 100 kilo male, keep the numbers nice and round, we have 3 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight if we're in a deficit, or at least 2 grams if we're in a surplus. Either going to be 2 or 3 times 100. Obviously that's going to be 2 and 300. If you are leaning towards the bottom side, somewhere around the 200 mark. If you're leaning towards the top side, which is I usually like to do, there's not too many negatives from having a high intake of protein versus a low. So we're going to say work with 300, meaning we have 5 meals. So 300 divided by 5 is going to equal 60, meaning that we're going to aim for 60 grams of protein per meal. So evenly spaced. It doesn't have to be exact. So for example, you could have, as up to low as 40 somewhere, pick it up 80 somewhere else, or you wouldn't even have to necessarily pick it up if we're aiming for the high mark of protein. But the point being, we want to have a constant supply of protein throughout the day in an amount that relates to how much muscle tissue you have. So we don't, for example, want to have a large period of time, say 7 hours in between these meals, even though they're in each meal. The main goal is to have a meal roughly every 3 to 4 hours, keeping our aminos constantly circulating in our blood. And same would go if you're going for 4 meals. We just knock one of these off, divided by 4. So then each meal will just become 75. Not clear in my writing, but if each meal then becomes 75, still the same concept applies as well. Now the meals might be that 4 hours apart, 4 hours in between each. Breakfast, morning tea, after work, training here, and then dinner, something like that. It doesn't matter how many you have. The main goal though is to have them constantly spread, never really going more than 4 or 5 hours without a meal, and every meal containing protein that is a good source, such as an animal protein Or if you're using vegan or plant-based proteins, you're combining different protein sources to make it a complete protein. Go over that in another video if we'll talk about protein sources, but for today, we're really just focusing on the timing of each macronutrient. Make sure that you're eating as soon as you wake up, getting the protein in straight away, not waiting a couple of hours because you've just spent 8 hours of the nighttime fasting, and so you want to get that protein as soon as possible to keep going with our protein synthesis or to stop our protein breakdown. So next, we're going to be talking about carbs, which is probably going to be our next most important. Carbs, they're energy, but when do we need them? Around our training and activity. So this will vary differently depending on when you train or what kind of job you have, if you have any extracurriculars outside of training as well. But the main one that's going to be around is our training. So say for example, this is breakfast, let's call it 7 a.m. And then next one is at 10. Next one's going to be somewhere around 1. Next meal somewhere around 4. And our last meal somewhere around 8. So in this example, which would be most people, breakfast, some kind of morning tea, lunch, towards the end of work / after work, that might be a little later. So people are going to be training somewhere around here. So if we say we're training here, this means that at this period of time, we need some carbohydrates. So we need carbs to train and we need carbs to recover from training. So before and after training is the most important time for carbohydrates. This is also referred to as the peri-workout window, which is just basically pre, intra, and post. Over 60% of what we're consuming for the day will be consumed within those pre, post, and possibly even intra. So if we're looking at this for a day, say for example, once again, we're working with our 100 kilo male. Say we're in somewhat of a deficit, not super aggressive. For example, me right now, eating around 300 grams of carbs. We want at least 60% of that to be in our pre and post, so 30 and 30. So 1/3 of that is around 100 and 1/3 of that is another 100. So then we have about 60%. So for example, in this meal prior to training, we're going to have grams of carbs here. We're going to have 100 grams of carbs here. And usually I would have some kind of intra. When I'm cutting, I bring it down to around 20 to 30 grams, say 20 grams here. So of my 300 grams of carbs for the day, since I don't really have any other activity, majority of it's going to be spent here when I actually need it. Meaning that these other meals here, get the leftover, 100 plus 100 is 200, 200 plus 20 is 220, 300 minus 220 is 80. So I've got 80 left to spread across these 3 meals. Now, what I like to do is have my morning meal with 0 carbs and a little bit higher fats, because if you're training here and you have your post-workout, there's 2 ways to think about that. As if you're training before your last meal, you can either try and get your carbohydrates and protein to digest really quickly and get into that post-workout window and recover a lot faster because they're in there, but then you have a prolonged period of fasting where there aren't drip-fed nutrients. Or you can consider it the other way, where it's not necessarily getting in fast for that post-workout window where it's a little bit more efficient, but you do have the drip feed overnight time. And that would be the consideration where if you would put fats into this meal or not. What I like to do instead is I'll just have the faster carbs there and not put many fats, but I'll have a higher fat meal for breakfast, as it helps with mental clarity for me as well to not have carbs as I wake up, but I just have 6 eggs by themselves. So we'll have 0 carbohydrates here. And then the other 2, I like to split them evenly, 40 and 40. Because your brain still does use glucose as you are just even thinking. Your brain uses carbs all the time when you're doing nothing. So this is what our meal structure would look like. Now, the reason we do this is because when we're training, we're using our carbohydrates to train, and we also want to have carbohydrates post to recover. So what this graph here is going to be time along this axis, clearly the amount of carbohydrates we have in our body, muscle glycogen stores essentially. So it's not going to be exactly accurate, but the amount of carbs that we have basically in our body. So sort of 0 somewhere here, completely full probably somewhere around say 350. And then each mark here, 100, 200, 300. So at the beginning of the day, we'd probably begin somewhere around here. We're constantly going to using glucose, so we're going to be coming down at a constant state as we are consuming it, even if we're doing nothing for the day. And the closer we are to this line, the more likely that we're going to be using our body fat as stores, as we're not going to be consuming enough energy to maintain our body, and we're going to have to utilize more fatty acids for energy. So If you are in a deficit, you want to chill around this line. If you are in a gaining phase, you don't want to be anywhere near this line. So this is going to be much more towards a deficit where timing does become a lot more important. When you are gaining, there's so many carbs in your system all the time and you're floating up here so much that you're never really going to dip to the point where you're going to run out of carbohydrates whilst training, but it is still good to still stack your carbohydrates in this way, especially when we're talking about the post and intra, as it has other effects other than just having the carbohydrates in your system to train, but it restores muscle glycogen more effectively after training. And also if we have some kind of sugar during training, it has been shown to blunt cortisol, which leads to more hypertrophy. It's good to hear, but then we bump it up 40, we sort of go up, but then once again, we start using those carbohydrates, come back down, bumping up again. Then once again, we start coming down. And then prior to training, we have this big increase up to somewhere here. But then because we're training, we do come down a lot sharper because we are using glycogen and carbs at a much faster rate than if we were just sitting down, doing work, whatever we're doing prior. Unless you are, an active worker, you have an active job. Basically, you would take the same structure and as someone who, say for example, this is a base of someone who sits down and does nothing all day, you'd probably still have the same amount of carbs here, but just to fund your activity throughout the day and not feel like dog shit, this number will just increase. So someone that is like this at 100 kilos but does nothing will be at 300 grams of carbs. Someone that's 100 kilos and has an active job, they might be at 400 grams of carbs, achieve the same product at the end of the day because they burned an extra 100 grams worth of carbs during their job. So that just gets burned. Add the extra 50 here, and you end up at the exact same spot by the time you get to meal 4. And we still want to do the same thing. So when we go here, we'd start dipping, but we're having our intra as well, which will help protect against that sharp drop, as well as pushing our cortisol down, which is a very catabolic hormone. We don't want high cortisol. So as it's coming down, probably get to somewhere here. And then when we have the post-workout, when we are in the post-workout window, the reason that the anabolic window exists, one, because leucine will trigger protein synthesis straight after start the rebuilding phase of the muscle. So you want to get protein in and specifically leucine in at that time. But two, our muscle glycogen recovers much faster because our GLUT4 receptors in our muscle cell allow glucose into the cell without insulin being present. That is why we want to have so many carbs post-workout, because when the carbs go up in our body here, majority of these here are going to be used more for muscle glycogen than other products, and that's going to be better for hypertrophy and muscle loss prevention. Then, for example, if we were to have the same amount of carbs for the day, but we flipped it, have vastly different outcomes as it pertains to training. So now a quick little bit about our peri-workout, which is going to be very important. Make sure that we have a meal about 1 hour before we train, an hour to an hour and a half. And what do we want to have? We'll have our equal protein share, and we'll have a carb source as well with 30% of our daily need. And if you are have a really fast metabolism and you're finding that you're crashing towards the end of your workout, you'll add a little bit of fat here to try and extend that digestion out whilst you're training. If not, I like to stay away so that my stomach's nice and flat and empty while I train. I don't want to feel full and bloated. And as well, if you're feeling full and bloated, try moving it a little bit further back towards that 1.5 hour mark. If you feel like you're ripping through it, you can move it towards that 1 hour mark. Everyone's different, the digestion speed, and depending on the food you use as well. So I usually like to have white rice. That's what sits really well with me. It's decently fast, but it's not so fast that it's going to make me crash during the workout. Then intra, ideal would be an EAA, so an essential amino acid product. All of the essential amino acids that our body can't produce, so that whilst we're training, if our body needs any protein, it's definitely up to its storage.
So we also wanted to have carb, ideally a very high glycemic index carbohydrate powder, such as dextrose, but some people can have a little bit of gastric upset with this as it draws water to the gut. The main thing is make sure you use enough water with it, or you can use something like Harley branch cyclodextrin, which does have a tendency to pull less water to the gut and have less stomach upset. Eventually, when you're using enough carbohydrate, you most likely be using a blend of these two. As dextrose is a little bit cheaper, can get going a little bit faster. You also want to make sure that our cortisol is lowered, as that's going to lead to greater hypertrophy and less catabolic actions. And then post-workout, make sure that again we have our even basic protein that we have in every one of our meals. Ideally now though, we want it to be a fast digesting source, such as a whey protein isolate. You can use a meat source, something like that, but ideally a whey protein isolate so that protein synthesis can start straight away, and we have enough leucine to basically kickstart our protein synthesis. As well as carbohydrates, we definitely want to ideally steer towards a high glycemic index carb, so it gets in fast while that mechanism of action that causes our body to be able to take in all the carbs without insulin into our muscles is still in effect, rather than having it be slow and that effect start to wane off before our carbohydrates enter our bloodstream. Ideally in this meal as well, we don't want to have many fats because we don't want to slow down the digestion speed of these two macronutrients. The only time, as I said, we might do that is if it is our last meal of the day before we go to bed, and we do want to slow them down, in which case we probably also change the carbohydrates to a lower glycemic index carb. Last of all, fats is probably the least important of all the macronutrients. The main thing we have to remember is good for our hormones and our health, as long as we're eating good sources. The main thing it does is slow the digestion down. So we want to have fats with any meal that we want to slow down the digestion of. You can either spread it somewhat evenly through the first 3 meals. Say if we're still having our training here, pre and post, I ideally don't like them here, but if once again you've got that fast metabolism, want to slow it down, you can have it here. Definitely don't want it here, once again, unless it is before bed and you are choosing to opt for the option of extending that release out so that it bridges overnight rather than going in fast and quick. If, for example, training was here, there'd be no consideration to having fats in this meal, and you would probably, absolutely, want to have fats here, which is what I do. So for me, myself, I train after 2 or 3 meals. So if I train after 3 meals, I'll have 0 carb here, but with fats. I'll have high carbs in this meal, even a little bit higher carbs in this meal. I'll have my initial workouts, a little bit of carbs here, then high carbs here. And then my last meal will be medium carbs because it's still going to be replenishing glycogen, but I'll also have fats here to extend it over the nighttime. And as I said, I just like to have fats in the morning with no carbs because it gives me good mental clarity to get some work done. So when it comes to carbohydrates for your training, sometimes just having 1 meal of carbohydrate isn't going to be enough. Hierarchy of importance. If our training is after that 3rd meal, most important ones are here and here. So we want to get those up almost as high as we can with it being comfortable. Then the next one that we would improve is here and here, adding more carbs to them. This for training performance during the gym, and this for recovery post. So if you're having issues with recovering from your previous training, you put them more here. If you're having issues with performing, you feel like you could go harder, but you're kind of depleted, then you would put more here. If I were to train after 2 meals, and I don't have my fat meal here because I want to get enough carbohydrates in prior to my workout. So I have a medium carb meal here, high carb meal, medium carb meal, and then I have 0 to very, very low carb here. So fats are basically just used as nighttime, as for the slowing rate prior to your training if you rip through your carbohydrates too much, or if you want to try and experiment with the mental clarity of not having carbohydrates for breakfast, then having something like I only have 6 eggs for breakfast, nothing else. And that makes me feel really good as well. When I have coffee, especially, I feel really focused, really switched on. And then I start eating my 2 meals prior to the gym, ready to get my carbohydrate stores high and have a great workout. So the quick basics of it all is you want to have protein evenly spread throughout the day, as evenly as possible for however many meals you have. Carbohydrates, you want to have at least 30% of your daily 30% of your daily post-workout, a little bit of carbohydrates during your training, a sugar or a very fast digesting carb. And then you want to have your fats somewhere where you want to slow down digestion, which would usually be at nighttime, if you are fast metabolism before training, and if you want to try with the mental clarity, having them with breakfast as well. Then we come to our supplements. So this is not a massively important part, but it still is a part of timing. So I like to have, creatine is best absorbed when it is taken with carbohydrates. So I usually put it in my intra shake as well, because you've got blood flow to the muscles at that point in time as well. You're going to get a little bit better absorption. So intra is the most optimal, or post-workout. because you're not really going to be affected by the creatine you have now, but it's going to be absorbed better into your muscles for the next time. Beta-alanine, pre-workout, because if you get the paresthesia I just get pissed off from it. That's the best time. But as far as actual efficacy, same again, intra and post for beta-alanine. L-carnitine, your best timing is prior to cardio or prior to your training, somewhere you're going to be doing high activity and mobilizing your fatty acids. It would be more ideal in a place where you have low food, because it's going to help mobilize the fatty acids, where if you had high food or high carb rather, you're going to be using carbohydrate as a source mainly anyway, and then fat mobilization isn't really going to matter. WPI, you're usually going to be post-workout, so your whey protein isolate. These are the main supplements that I use. There's not many others. Obviously, pre-workout is inherent in the name when you're going to have it. Hopefully, I don't have to explain that. And then your carbohydrates, obviously, intra, we already went through that. AAs, during, already went through that as well. So that is where you should do your meal timing. If you have any more questions, leave me a comment, and I'll hopefully be able to help you out.